And the Turkish spies is interesting because a lot of the radical ideas about Islam by these Protestants was circulating in that fictional form, and it was widely consumed that way. So you could think of the Turkish spy as one of those key missing links. And this was a work that was reprinted and reread all the way to the 19th, even 20th century.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Islam and the Idea of America podcast, the deep dive talk series. I'm so excited to kick off this series with a very special guest today. If you enjoy listening to the stories on this podcast, you'll love this deep dive conversations with writers and special guests where we explore those stories even further. Today, I'm honored to have a very special guest for our first talk, deep dive, Professor Humberto Garcia. Dr. Garcia is professor and Vincent Hilliard Chair of Literature at the University of California, Merced. He studies in 18th and 19th century British literature in a global context with an emphasis on Anglo-Islamic relations. His research on the intersections of race, gender, class, and Orientalism in the literature and art of this period has appeared in a variety of journals, including Studies in Romanticism, English Literary History, and Comparative Literature. Among his most important publications are Islam and the English Enlightenment, which is the book that we will be going in a deep way today. And later, England reoriented how Central and South Asian travelers imagined the West. Cambridge University Press, 2020. Both books funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Very prestigious. Professor Garcia, thank you so much for joining the show. I'm so excited. My voice is clearly very much excited. So it's really an honor to have you. Your book, Islam and the English Enlightenment, is amazing. It was really eye-opening to me when I first discovered it a few years ago. And I wish I had known about it earlier because although it was published 2012, right, the insights are so fresh. It feels so fresh to me. And I believe it is really transformative, truly transformative. It allows the reader to see early modern era through a new paradigm. So I really thank you for this opportunity. And I like to really set the stage with the story of the book. So was it your doctoral dissertation or what made you to go into this story, Islam and the English Enlightenment?
First of all, Mustafa, thank you for having me here and having this opportunity to share my research with the general public. And thank you for your kind words. But kind of what led me here was a combination of issues. I mean, this was part of my doctoral dissertation. And of course, the immediate context in my research was the 9/11 terrorist attacks at that time. I was in grad school. Well, and of course, the emerging discourse, the very kind of polarized discourse that emerged after that period. With the whole war on terror during that time and the revival of various narratives of the clash of civilizations, that Islam and Western European culture and Christianity are fundamentally incompatible and bound for tension, right, and for conflict. And it was in the midst of all that backdrop, right, of those years, that I was then also reading the early modern period, going back to the 17th century, and looking at the way that a number of Protestant reformers, people who were not fans, right, of the established Orthodox Church, let's say in England, the Anglican Church, or not happy with monarchy as a form of government, began to read widely, right? both in terms of like earlier English works, but even outside the English writing, and particularly Arabic writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Among many other kinds. But there was a branching out um, to understand different kinds of world religions. Islam was among them, and not the only one, by the way. They were looking at Confucianism, they were looking at early Judaism, mystical traditions, anything outside the Orthodox Christian tradition, in order to understand their political and religious situation, of course, coming out of this context of religious wars that have been going on in the 17th century. And Islam to them was particularly fascinating more than any other world religion because, of course, Islam shares a lot of the biblical stories, right, with Christianity and Judaism as being one of the three Abrahamic faiths, and going back to principles of monotheism. So, what I saw then is these Protestants who had this deep sympathy and positive regard for Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. Granted, these were still representations, right? These were still, it's not like these Protestants were actually, literally practicing Muslims, praying 5 times a day, right? No, I'm not converting. This is not what I'm saying here. But Protestant Mohammedans was kind of this kind of rhetorical or fanciful, if you will, fictional kind of construct that they absorbed because they were reading the Quran and Prophet Muhammad's message through a particular kind of legalistic lens, what I call civic republicanism. And let's be clear what I mean by civic
Right,
republicanism,
because
not to be confused with current republicanism. About the idea that that government should not be dominated by a king, right? That it should be some sort of representative government. Of course, how that takes place and what form that takes is heavily in debate. And because it was such a new experiment, these early Protestant thinkers who were looking for toleration, for looking for civic enfranchisement, because at this time, let's say like in England, the Anglican state had severe penalties on those who did not conform to the Anglican faith. And they were desperately looking for a model of inclusion and pluralism. And they looked to Islam, and particularly Islamic empires of that time period, which did have policies of what we could call toleration, right? You know,
Mhm.
the caveat here with certain restrictions, right? But they were nonetheless seeing that Muslim countries like the Ottoman Empire, for instance, were able to incorporate Christians upon paying a poll tax. Granted, they were treated as second-class citizens, but nonetheless, they were not persecuted and they were allowed to practice their faith and given clerical autonomy to determine their church structure and did not have to obey any kind of centralized Christian authority that would either persecute them if they did not follow the established faith, or would disenfranchise them from government even because here you had an Ottoman Empire that not only tolerated Christians, including Christian dissenters and Protestants, but actually incorporated them into government. And some of them did so, right? And so here you had then a number of dissenting thinkers, people like Henry Stubbe, for instance. We could say more about that later, but also John Locke, and a number of Enlightenment thinkers or free thinkers in general, what we call a number of them Deists, Unitarians, people who rejected Orthodox kind of Christian teachings about, let's say, the Trinity, right? The idea of God, the Father, and the Spirit as being one, or, they rejected all that. The idea of Jesus as being the incarnation of God, right? And they were beginning to see this as part of a social and political system of domination and control. And then they started looking toward Islam as practiced by other Muslim empires in that period. And they were receiving reports about this. They were reading about this. They were very knowledgeable of it and seeing a different kind of model of governance that they actually wanted to put into practice. So it's this kind of political fantasy. That's what we really mean by Protestant
Okay,
Mohammedans,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. I think it was really the most intriguing concepts I encountered in your book. And I was thinking about also the Mohammedan Christianity, which is a similar concept, which was, I think, later developed, maybe John Toland and again, Henry Stubbe to John Toland. But I like to, of course, ask you that missing link when we think about Henry Stubbe and these early thinkers and their influence on free thinkers, especially Stubbe's work on Islam as a kind of missing link between the English Enlightenment and the revolutions in France and America. So could you please unpack that connection of these revolutions for us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Henry Stubbe's manuscript, is one that seemed to have circulated pretty widely, although because this was so secretive and these ideas were so dangerous and radical of the time, it's really hard to connect all the dots, right? There's a lot of secrecy here, right? And the fact that was never published, of course, if it would have been published, someone like Henry Stubbe would have found himself in political trouble, right? Given that time period, there were very restrictive laws against this kind of stuff. It would have been taken as heresy or atheism, right? Henry Stubbe could have found himself in jail or worse, right? As many other dissenters were being persecuted, killed, fined, jailed at this time period.
Even there was, I think, the latest execution was happening 1700 or 1699,
Yes.
with right. So even not only jail or losing a job, but it's really a life threat for them, right?
It's a life threat. It's a life threat. And also let's remember, England just came out of a very bloody civil war, right? Precisely over this question of what kind of country England is going to be, both in terms of government style, but also what kind of a country it is going to be religiously, whether Protestant, Catholic, or something in between or moderate, right? England was in a major kind of identity crisis at this time period. And along with that came a bunch of perils and dangers about how people were going to express themselves, given a number of restrictions on the press as well. So there was a lively manuscript culture, a kind of underground, if you will, where it's not just people were reading stuff that coming out of the printing press, which is, of course, very regulated, but from manuscripts, which were less so regulated and more clandestine. And so we know very little about that dark world precisely because the archive is so sketchy, right, and so limited. But what we do know is that two things. One is a lot of these thinkers, whether it's John Locke or John Toland, as you mentioned earlier, were continuously referencing these ideas of a kind of Protestant Mohammedanism, right, of various sorts, right? These ideas were picking up at the time. Yes, Henry Stubbe certainly is part of that missing link, but he's not the only one.
Okay.
Of course, you also have the Unitarians, which were also very much engaged, right, with Islam and have their own kind of historical and intellectual genealogy.
And
right?
even Quakers, right?
And even Quakers as well.
At the same
right?
time, George Fox to the Grand Turk.
George Fox, Grand Turk. And again, that shows you how much these radical dissenters were thinking about the Ottoman Empire, not just the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, but the way it was institutionalized in the Ottoman Empire, for instance. And so this was a time period where there are various missing links here, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And part of that link is a very lively manuscript culture, which has rarely been studied by historians. Number one, because it's so difficult to access. But number two, because this is part of outside the mainstream story of the way we understand the secular Enlightenment, and it pushes back on the narrative that Islam was not anti-Enlightenment, was not outside the Enlightenment, but actually integral and shaped within it.
I think
these ideas disseminated widely and into America and England. And we could talk more about that afterwards.
Yeah, I think I like to follow up because it was fascinating to me to see the republicanism, Islamic republican ideals, if you will, with those republicans at that time using Islam as a beating stick to against the elite, was also making discursive space among themselves. Like John Milton was using a despot, right? So he's also a Republican. He is a friend of, perhaps these thinkers, Henry Vane and others, but it becomes like a discursive space in which Islam can be used in many different ways, but certainly in the conversation. So it's not, as far as I understand, again, it's a question, it's very complex. There's no one narrative or there is no one model. That becomes also a complexity for perhaps the academics to look at this world as sort of secretive writing and interpretation and later interpretations as well, like Voltaire thinking about Newton in a way that is absolutely different from the Newton's time and his interpretive schema.
Yes, a lot of these radical Enlightenment thinkers were not a fan of the Trinity and Orthodox Christianity. Let's be clear about that, right? Like, they were unwilling to accept a lot of basic precepts from Christianity that were determined by the Council of Nicaea since 325, which is a repudiation of that time of what is called the Arian heresy. And Arian here is Arain, right? The theology, not the racial theory that came in the 19th century, but the idea that Christ was pretty much a good human teacher or a prophetic figure of some sort, but not the Son of God, right? So a lot of these thinkers, including people like Newton and Voltaire, were very much on board with those radical ideas of the time. And in the United States, people like Thomas Jefferson, for instance, right? And at the same time, these thinkers, all of them in one way or another, were very much sympathetic to the teachings of the Qur'an, which they were reading through a very much a legalistic lens, and sympathetic to the Muslim empires that put these religious ideas as a way of practicing toleration by tolerating non-Muslim religions, right? So they're seeing this as a model. Now, the discursive space you're talking about is complicated, and it has to do with all these issues of persecution and blasphemy laws. So take Voltaire, for instance, wrote a very famous play in the 18th century, reproduced widely, on Muhammad the fanatic. Very Islamophobic, right?
It was also in fact, on play after 9/11, I think, right? So it
yes,
has been...
and it was revived after 9/11, right? And in fact, and this play became so popular, right? That Voltaire actually dedicated or gifted a copy of this at the time to Pope Benedict the Fourth, right? And the Pope actually praised this work, as anti-Islamic work. At the same time, the work and the play was also being read as a veiled critique of the Catholic Church and Catholic fanaticism. Mm-hmm. So you see that that's the complex discursive space that's really difficult to unpack, because a lot of these thinkers would adopt, as a way to get their ideas in the public hiddenly, they would adopt kind of an anti-Islamic posturing, a rhetorical posturing, to get past the censors. And then in between the lines, they were also critiquing the current political structure of the time. And Voltaire, just like he had, like he was kind of, people have talked about the way he demonizes Islam and how that play was revived after 9/11. But yet at the same time, his biggest concern was a Catholic Europe. That was his biggest fear.
I think that
right.
is,
and then in other places, Voltaire actually has nice things to say about the Quran, right?
And later in his life, right?
It's complicated, right? It's complicated.
Yeah. So I see this as, since you're looking at this context in a wide way, like coming from the discursive rhetorical strategies mid 17th century to mid 18th century, right, Voltaire's time, it is most interesting to me to see that it is something that is learned, that is something that is happening generations after generations. And when I'm saying it, using Oriental despot, right, someone as, again, the enemy, right, but at the same time using it in a way to criticize and engage and also change and reform along the way. Initially, it was very tough, but after, the momentum, to be gained, then it becomes really a strategy that is very popular, right? So again, Daniel Defoe's written, I learned from you, right? You mentioned Defoe's strategy, letters written by a Turkish spy, which has become very popular. Then Lady Mary Montego, you're mentioning it in other chapter, and Montesquieu. So they are all learning these things. And then it becomes like, and when we come to Voltaire and others, maybe later, other writers, it becomes something that is very much with the Western part of the Western literature, how they engage. And what I learned from you, from your work, again, that's the reason that it is eye-opening. We need to go back um, and look at the links before jumping into Orientalist literature or Orientalism, conceptually speaking, because we typically, and in my classes as well, we typically start after Napoleon's invasion to Egypt and looking at the 1800s. And then we're really missing what has been learned in the cultural and structural elements in that picture. If you don't get it, you are perhaps misinterpreting the very literature that you're studying. How do you
Yeah.
feel?
Yeah, no, you're right. Yes, yeah, that's exactly what I would have said, right?
Mhm.
And the fact that a lot of this times, the whole idea of using Islam as a beating stick was not about Islamophobia; it was about Islamophilia, right? That's the
Mhm.
larger story that we're missing here. And yes, it's a representation. Yes, it's a fantasy. Yes, it's a construct. And it was mainly serving a way for these radical Protestants to define their identity and model an idea of what they would like as a good government, right? But at the same time, this was about determining an identity, right?
Right.
This was about actually, if there's any kind of enemy here, the enemy is not Islam; it's the enemy within. It's those Christians who were bickering with each other. So this Islam became this beating stick for for negotiating this sectarian strife within Christendom at
Mhm.
the time period.
Mhm.
I mean, Letters of a Turkish Spy is a classic case study in that regards, right?
Yes.
I mean, talk about how these ideas disseminated, and going back to your question of the missing link, fiction right? A lot of these ideas were disseminated not just as philosophical treatises or historiography as we have with Henry Stubbe. A lot of those ideas then ended up in these fictions about Muslim characters who infiltrated Europe as a spy, which is what the Turkish Spy Letters are about, and reporting back on everything that's going on in Christendom at that time period. And the Turkish spies is interesting because a lot of the radical ideas about Islam by these Protestants was circulating in that fictional form, and it was widely consumed that way. So you could think of the Turkish spy as one of those key missing links. And this was a work that was reprinted and reread all the way to the 19th, even 20th century. People continued reading this on both sides of the Atlantic.
And we don't know the
And the
exact
story,
author. We don't know
and we
this.
don't know, there's multiple authors, and a lot of them are hiding away, right? I mean, they're anonymous, and there's a reason for that. These were very radical ideas, and the Turkish spy letters actually kicked off in 1683, which was very important, and Defoe notes this complete right so, because it is at this time when, of course, you had the siege of Vienna, where the Ottomans joined forces with Protestant Hungarians who would prefer to march with the Ottomans to take over the Habsburg Empire, overthrow Habsburg rule in Vienna, and would prefer to live as minorities, protected religious minorities under the Ottoman Empire. So this is a classic case study because the siege of Vienna has been interpreted by historians in the past as the clash of civilizations, right? Here's the showdown, right? Between, the Christian West and the Muslim East. It seems like it fits into this clash of civilization narratives or into the story of Orientalism, right? But in fact, that was not the case. The clash of civilizations there was ultimately about the question of whether Europe was going to be Catholic or Protestant. It was an internal fight, right? And of course, the Ottomans were exploiting this geopolitically to try to move into Europe. And Europe almost could have become a Muslim country. I mean, Europe could have, I mean, if that siege of Vienna would have been successful, the Ottoman Empire would have had an inroad to move into Europe, even all the way and aligning itself with France. And the Sultan at the time had an agenda of converting Christian Europeans to Islam. And a lot of Hungarian Protestants and people in Eastern Europe didn't seem to have a problem with that. So this was a very heated moment, and it's in this time period where ideas by people like John Locke and Henry Stubbe, right, and John Toland are circulating, and you can see how these ideas are geopolitically charged. What's at stake here is the fate of Europe itself and Christendom. Defoe understood this, right? When he went back and added his own version of the Turkish spy, right? And made a big deal about the siege of Vienna. And he spends a whole time demonizing not really the Ottomans or the Turks. In fact, he kind of liked they're a model of government in some level. What he was really doing is using them and Islam and the Turks as a beating stick against the Protestants, who he saw as endangering the balance of power in Europe by siding with the Turks and by accepting all these Islamophilic ideas. So you see the story about the clash of civilizations, East and West, and Orientalism is much more murky and complicated. And it's about this deep identity crisis that both England and Europe found itself in the late 17th century.
Yeah, and conceptually, you also make a big contribution to the secularization narrative, I believe, because typically the classical narrative is Enlightenment is about the freedom from religion, and thinkers, free thinkers, and others are
Right.
making the revelation out of the game, and then it becomes like a universal era of modernity, right? So, but
Yes.
you are making us to think early deists and those who are coming into these conversations are not necessarily talking about some secular new phenomena. Rather, they are engaging Mosaical laws, or early Christians, Nazarenes, or they are all using a lot of religious discourse in many ways, not only just strategically, but also very much believing in it. Like, again, Newton is maybe a very good example, theologically getting engaged with Islam as well. And again, another example, it was fascinating to me, George Fox using Qur'an verses from a very, I think, bad translation of Quran, Alexander Ross Quran, right? It's not the Jefferson's Quran, but he is trying to pick up, more than 30 verses from Quran to convince Muslims that they are not doing the right thing. It was really not only putting the enemy and making them, again, demonized, but rather engaging with the Muslim scripture.
Yes, yeah, and like you said, actually, and the Quakers is an interesting case, right? Because a lot of them, even though they were kind of castigating the Sultan for not being a good Christian, their basis of their idea was, if you follow the Quran well enough, you'll see that it's actually a Christian idea. I mean, it's very ironic, right? It's very ironic. The Christian teachings are already in the Quran. You just need to be faithful and follow them. And so a lot of these Protestants found in the Quran, especially the repudiation of the whole idea of Jesus being the Son of God, and they were gravitating toward that, and they were sympathetic to that argument in the Quran. And they were seeing actually the Quran as perhaps more, how should I say, in this time period, rational, or more about reason, right? Or facilitating independent reasoning, right, in readers to engage with the holy book in their own terms, rather than receive this secondhand or filtered through the clergy or through the established church, right? And so this is what they were finding very much appealing. If you don't mind, I could also say a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson's
Please.
Quran, because that's an
Yes,
interesting
that
case
was my
study.
next question. How we can get that link
Yeah,
between.
because we are here, discussing, Islam and the idea of America, right? And it's very interesting to me. I mean, talk about complicated Enlightenment figures here. Thomas Jefferson is another case in point, right? He, when he was studying law, right, around 1765, one of his first inclinations was to study the Quran as translated by George Sale. And George Sale, by the way, was in the midst of all these deist debates. He was a hardcore Orthodox Anglican, mind you, and a defender of the English Church and State. But at the same time, he was actually in dialogue with and in a sense produced that Quran, that new translation, right? Like you said, it was a more accurate one than the previous Alexander Ross ones. But nonetheless, he produced that because of these debates about deism that people were taking so seriously. But nonetheless, in that version of the Quran there by George Sale, he talks about Muhammad as a prophetic legislator, a civic legislator, just like the legislators of ancient antiquity. This is what Thomas Jefferson was reading as part of his law study. And he's not unique in that. This would have been becoming part of the study of law in the connection to the development of world religions. This was standard curricula stuff for people of the Enlightenment, right? And he was also, of course, reading John Locke and, reading all that stuff that was talking about how, dissenting Christians are tolerated in the Ottoman Empire, right? So he has his personal copy of, the Quran, which he held on to when he was studying. At the same time, he had a copy of the Bible, which he actually tore pages from and actually tore words out, particularly the parts that he did not like about, the incarnation of God or anything that implied orthodoxy. And he was changing the Bible story. And here he is writing Margellina notes about how much he admires Prophet Muhammad as a legislator and his teachings, right? And, and by the way, that Quran is still in the Library of Congress, right? Which is interesting to know. If you look at, and if you go to the reading room in the Library of Conference, the Thomas Jefferson building, right? And you look up at the dome. If you've ever been there, if anyone's been there, I suggest they do this. They look up at the dome and you'll see all the wise legislators of history. And in there, you're going to see an Arab with an open book and a scientific instrument, right? Another example, go to the frieze on the north frieze of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. And you're going to see there a sculpture of Prophet Muhammad, the lawgiver, right? In between Charlemagne and the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. So this shows you how these ideas, which was not just Thomas Jefferson, they became part of the fabric of understanding American republicanism and democracy, right? And it became part of a founding myth, right? And this is an Islam that's integrated within,
Right.
the idea of American constitutionalism and republicanism. So, Thomas Jefferson's a classic case study. And then at the same time, Thomas Jefferson was somebody who in public spoke out against Islam. So you see, these are complicated figures, right?
I
They're
think
doing one thing in public, another thing in private.
I think that's what I love to learn from your book, because I had some knowledge, especially, again, another great book, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an,
Yeah.
right? So I heard about Jefferson, but I never thought about that cultural context that produced Jefferson, cultural context that made George Sale, having that translation, criticizing the earlier translation of Alexander Ross, right? The first one, and saying this is a bad Arabic, no good French. It's again, it was really, it's happening over a course of how many generations, right? It's just something. Islam has been there in the conversation, whether good or bad, but it was a part of the engagement. It was part of the story. So it's not something that is, again, coming to be seen after the migration waves to America. Rather, it was something in that picture in early modern era, very early on. And that made me to, again, think about these big picture secularization narrative, as well as Orientalism of Edward Said narrative. And for sure, it's just a contribution to these literatures. Again, that is another thing that I like in your book. You're saying you're not negating Edward Said's Orientalist perspective. Rather, you're just putting something additional, enriching elements to that picture.
Yeah. Orientalism is only part of the story, not the whole story.
Right. And I know we have a limited time, but I like to, of course, think about the later chapters of your book. And that is fascinating to see the reason and the rational debates initially with the deists and others, becoming maybe 100 years later more engaging among romantics circles and some other elements of Islam or Sufism, and then of course coming even to American literature with Emerson and others. And again, since we have a limited time, and I would love to have a future conversations with you on the other chapters. May I get a promise on the record?
Yeah. Yes, I will.
So that is for me very important to see how we can make the conceptual linkage between how to approach Islam from a rational debate and then coming to spiritual debate and other elements. If you'd like to say a few words, please do. But I would love to have a special conversation on the later chapters with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll briefly say here that British Romantic poets, people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, Percy Shelley, were kind of receiving this inheritance from people like Henry Stubbe, John Locke, and Voltaire, and all these people we talked about. And of course, they were reading the Turkish Spy Letters and all this kind of stuff. And they were going back, and they were again thinking of this question of what kind of a country Britain wants to be, or what kind of an empire it's going to be, right? Mm-hmm. And the similar kind of debates are going on later in the 19th century in the United States with people like Washington Irving, for instance, who's thinking a lot about Prophet Muhammad as a lawgiver, right? And then Emerson, who's very fascinated with Sufi poetry and the Persian literature in general. And, these are ways in which Islam here becomes part of, it becomes part of the narrative of what we're talking about here, secularization, right? Although, of course, recognize that in that time period, people didn't think that way. They didn't talk about secularization. They didn't have that word, right? Because these were new ideas that were developing at the time, right? The whole idea of the separation of church and state and all that. They didn't have the language we now have. They were developing that language by engaging in a very imaginative way with the Muslim world and with the Quran. Now, of course, and let's be clear for the record here, again, I emphasize because some people get confused over this. It's not like they're looking to Islam in order to actually practice it as a religious faith, right? Let's be clear. These people were not going to do the pilgrimage to Mecca, for instance, right? They were not, praying 5 times a day, but they were interested in the theology that they could appropriate, right? And use for their own purposes. A lot of time to lash out at the enemies, but really about defining themselves and who they are and what is secular and what is secular governance, right? And they were doing that by integrating Islam back into the story of Judeo-Christianity, right? And in order to create this myth or idea, which is a powerful one, about Prophet Muhammad as this Republican lawgiver. Again, it's still here today, by the way. Again, go to the Supreme Court Frieze building. There it is. That heritage is still part of America. Even though we don't talk about it, it's present. Go to the Library of Congress and look at look up at the ceiling. Remnants of that worldview are still there. And that's also an important story about the development of secular democracy in the United States.
Yeah, this is fascinating. As we conclude, I'd like to ask a couple of big picture questions. This secularization narrative is not necessarily, I think, important from the shift within the Western paradigm, but also those who are seeing secular or some concepts like democracy or other elements in that package, if you will, to be seen as Western, as something that is produced in a certain environment, which was not necessarily inclusive of their perspectives. And it's something that could, I think, help certain elements immediately associated with the Western discourse is also shattered in this new paradigm.
Right. But it also allows us to read our own moment in a different way, right? So this is also about the present, right? I mean, to go back to Thomas Jefferson's Quran, right? It was in 2006 when Keith Ellison, the first African American elected to Congress from Minnesota, right, and the first Muslim to serve in this capacity, he took a ceremonial oath in office using Thomas Jefferson's personal copy of George Sale's Quran. right? So you see, these things continue to have an afterlife, right? And those stories are not just musty old stories from the past, but continuing stories that are very much here with us and that we need to learn from to get a complete picture of how this grand experiment of American democracy developed, right? And so far, what we have is a very one-sided, narrow view of, the founding fathers, right, and the Enlightenment along with that. And what I'm hoping is that the ideas that I'm showing here show that how they get revived and reintegrated in the 20th and 21st century. And I think it's also important to see that the way that things in the early modern period in the past speak to our own contemporary moment, given, and again, a very divisive moment, but very different from the past. This is not about East versus West, but, in that past, that tells us the way that Islam is very much integral to those democratic values that we all cherish at some level, whether it's freedom of speech, toleration, right? These that we need to understand these kind of what we call secular concepts of ones that developed with a deep personal and imaginative engagement with the Muslim world and Islam as a theology and as a worldview.
And my final question, as far as I see, this kind of research focusing on Islam and the early Enlightenment is relatively new. It looks like to me. I do know some other names like yourself producing a lot of innovative research, and some names in Europe as well. But it looks like it's relatively new in the academia. Is that accurate?
It was more new when the book first came out in 2012. I think, ever since there's been a lot more attention to this. There's been a lot more work on the 17th century, for instance, and how really the development of early Arabic studies in Europe, particularly the engagement with Ottoman scholars, right? People in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century who were thinking. So a lot of things are coming out. I think earlier you mentioned in passing Denise Spellberg's book, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Islam and the Founders, which again, I highly recommend that book. I mean, because it's a fascinating, probably somebody you want actually to include in this podcast in the future, because there is an interesting story as well about how these ideas came over to the United States. And I think there's a level of research. There are other people now researching the connection with Islam, Persian poetry, and Emerson, for instance.
Yes.
So it's not so new anymore, although of course there's a lot more to say, and there's a lot of room here for really unraveling and unpacking this rather complex story on both sides of the Atlantic. And also how these ideas spread around the world. I mean, Henry Stubbe, for instance, the other story of Henry Stubbe we need to talk about is the way that it was revived by Ottoman reformers in the early 20th century, where they were reading Henry Stubbe in order to critique British imperialism. I mean, that's another story, right? And so these are the kind of things that I think we need more research of. So it's still relatively new, but there's a lot that's happened and a lot more that still needs to be happened in terms of research. It's a rich topic.
Professor Garcia, it's fascinating to learn from you as always, and it has been a pleasure. So thank you so much for joining on the show.
Thank you for having me here. It's been a real pleasure and really fascinating with this topic. And I really am a fan of this podcast and would really love to hear more on this topic and these other connections that we're making.